Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg.
Well, we've just woken up to news in the UK that Donald Trump overnight has ordered strikes on Iran.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the three key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
So joining me to break down these huge consequential developments is Jonathan Schanzer from the Foundation of the Defense of Democracies in the US. Jonathan previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the US Treasury, and there he followed and froze the funding of Hamas and al-Qaeda. He has been studying intensely this conflict, and his most recent book is Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. He has written many other books on the region, and I'm so thrilled to say he has joined me for the podcast for a hugely detailed and rich discussion about what all this means and where we go from here. Jonathan Schanzer, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
So what just happened?
Donald Trump made good on his threat, and he bombed 3 nuclear sites in Iran, the biggest of which was the Fordow facility, which is something like 90 or 100 meters below ground with reinforced concrete. That was struck with a MOP, as it's known, a massive ordnance penetrator. It literally drills down into the mountain, and then after a certain amount of time, detonates a 5,000-pound bomb, and in the process, implodes everything around it. There were other sites that were hit, Natanz as well as Isfahan. Unclear what kind of munitions were used, although I do understand that there were Tomahawks that were also fired off of submarines from U.S. vessels that were in the vicinity. But bottom line is the Israelis had done about 75% of the work on the Iranian nuclear program, including going after 14 different scientists and the leaders of the program over the last 9 days since they launched that surprise attack. The U.S. has finished the last 25%.
So are these the bunker busting bombs that we have been reading about? Is that what America used?
So the MOP is a 30,000-pound bunker buster in essence. In other words, it drills down before it detonates. Now, I don't know if they were needed in Isfahan, and I don't know if they were needed in Natanz. It may take a little time for all of this to come out, but there will be a BDA, a battle damage assessment, that will be delivered by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and his generals. That's tomorrow, 8 a.m. Eastern time, or I guess today as we're speaking. At any rate, we're going to get an assessment there. That may be a preliminary assessment because that'll only be about 12 hours after the attacks. And that may not be enough time, but they're going to be poring over the intelligence. They'll be listening to the communications of the Iranian regime. They may even be able to get their hands on some of the video images of cameras that were in these facilities before they were destroyed. And you'll get a sense of how badly things were hit. But this was a big night because for the last 15 years, we've been talking about this nuclear program, and there have been agreements and interim agreements and threats to attack and diplomacy and failed diplomacy. I mean, this has been a long, drawn-out drama. And from what I am hearing right now from the Israelis and from when you hear from at least some of the bravado of the President of the United States, they're confident right now that this nuclear program is just not able to make a comeback, not for decades. And I can imagine that when you look around the region right now, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Egyptians, Jordanians, they look at the beating, the conventional beating that the regime has taken since Thursday night of last week, and now couple that with the U.S. and And let's just be clear, the statement made by the president that he was willing to do this and to drop these massive weapons on Iran's nuclear program, the regime has to make a decision now whether it is going to surrender. And that, I think, is possibly the most important thing that we will learn over the next 24 hours.
Surrender or retaliate?
Right. Now, if they surrender, that's a big deal. And it's a big deal because, quite frankly, for the regime to do this, the key pillars of their regime are death to America and death to Israel. And for them to capitulate to the two countries that have just unleashed on them over the last 9 days and then just the last few hours, that is a big deal. Can you still be the Islamic Republic of Iran after you have capitulated to your two most bitter enemies? So I think that's an interesting question. And then comes the question of, okay, well, if they don't want to surrender, then what we'll likely see is more missile attacks against Israel, maybe even some of the heavier weapons. Most of the ballistic missiles have had 1,000 kilogram payloads. We could see them move up to the 2,000 kilo payloads, which would create more devastation and destruction in Israel. And they may try to do that and fight to the end. But the Israelis now know that all they need to work on is military infrastructure and rocket launchers and the like. But the other thing that I think we're all going to be watching for is the asymmetric attacks in the West. So whether it's in the US or in the UK or Germany or France or anywhere else in Europe, this idea of sleeper cells being activated, you got to remember the regime in Iran is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. They've got Hamas and they've got Hezbollah and they've got the Houthis and the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. But also remember, I mean, they've been able to contract out mafia types and hitmen, and they've even recruited young kids to engage in violent attacks in places like Sweden.
Are you saying this will inspire or lead to directed terrorist attacks potentially in Western countries?
Look, what we're talking about right now is theoretical, right?
Mm.
I don't think anyone has said we know evidence. We do know what the regime has been capable of. Some of it has been recruitment and direct engagement with these actors in various countries and say, here's what you're going to do, and here's the plan, and here's the money, and here are the weapons, and here's the training. Then there are those that may be inspired by all of this, although we have not seen a lot of lone wolf Shia Iran inspired attacks. That's not been a very common thing. It's been more common on the Sunni side of the street, as we call it. But again, I think we're sort of at this fascinating and somewhat frightening crossroads where if we're a rational regime, they would wave the white flag. They have just been there, they have no air defense right now. The Israelis are operating literally, I mean, at will. When the foreign minister of Iran decided that he wanted to leave the country, he literally had to make sure that this was cleared by the Israelis. This is where they are right now. You don't come back from this. So the question I think that we have to ask ourselves is whether the regime is going to try to go out in a blaze of glory. And maybe they understand that they've been defeated, but they want to try to destroy Israel or wound the United States or to wound the UK in the process of going down. And that, I think, is what we're all waiting to see at this moment. Because again, I just don't, they do have missiles left. They probably have, I don't know, 1,500 ballistic missiles, but that's not going to win the war. It might create more damage with their enemies, but it's not going to win the war.
What about internally in Iran? Is the regime now under such pressure? Is it so weak that a civil uprising could topple it and finish it off?
Well, I have colleagues that are far smarter than me on this, but I think we all know that the people in Iran are much more friendly to Western ideas. They are younger. They're bitter about the way that they've been treated by the regime. They're bitter about the way that the regime has squandered its resources by funding terrorism and nuclear programs instead of schools and hospitals and bridges and just giving people more. This is a regime that's largely isolated. And I've got to imagine that there are a lot of people who are watching right now in Iran and wondering whether this is their moment. You have to remember, the West does not have a terrific history of supporting these people when they've come out into the streets, right? There have been massive movements in the past where the US has declined, the UK has declined, the Europeans have declined to support it. And so I think they're probably still looking around and wondering whether they get beaten back with brutality as they have in the past. But I think the big question that we have to ask ourselves with respect to this question is the regime strong enough to even mount an attack? If I'm a soldier working for the regime or I'm one of the thugs that is enforcing on the streets, I've got to wonder, is this regime going to be around tomorrow? And is it worth it for me to fight?
Mm.
And I do think that psychologically that's beginning to creep in because that nuclear, it's funny. I had an Israeli official try to explain that if you look at the way this war has progressed over the course of the last year and a half since the 10/7 attacks, what the Israelis had done is, I mean, they lost some pieces on the board early. Pawns, but they still lost pieces and they looked like they were about to lose. They came back and they started taking pieces off the board one at a time. Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria just collapsed. I mean, right? So all of those pieces are gone. And these are bishops and knights, right? These are stronger pieces for the regime. What they had left was their queen. That was the
Mm.
nuclear program. The queen has just been knocked off the board. The king is right now standing alone with some pawns.
So does that leave Israel having checkmated the region? How much has it redrawn the region in its own image now?
This is, I think, the big question. I do think that the US doing this in conjunction with the Israelis, Donald Trump teaming up and showing the region that the United States still views Israel as an asset is unmistakable right now for the Saudis, the Emiratis. They're looking around and saying, I want this ally. Look, they just bombed our arch enemy at the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I can get this, right? By normalizing with Israel, right? Now, the big question is, does Iran try to spoil the party?
Mm.
Do the missiles start coming in? And by the way, they can also not just hit Israel. They have warned in the past that they would go after the oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, that they would go after the oil infrastructure in the UAE, or to go after American bases in Bahrain, and the list goes on. So there's a fear still among these players in the region. And again, that gets us right back to this question of will they capitulate? Will they not? We want to see this surrender. Donald Trump put it actually very clearly. I thought, look, there are times where he engages in hyperbole and he engages in sort of very Trumpian style when he speaks. But he said, look, we want peace in the region. That's the end state that he's looking for. And that means surrender on the part of the regime. That's what he's aiming for now. And I just don't know how to read the Islamic Republic or what's left of it right now, but it's high drama.
Do you think Donald Trump did the right thing?
I do. I do. I think that American force was absolutely used in a way that felt a bit gratuitous for a while. And I have to say, I was a relatively young analyst coming into Washington in 2000 as this debate unfolded about going into Iraq. And
Mm.
I listened to people from the Office of Net Assessment who were telling everybody that it was going to be a cakewalk. These were Pentagon officials who were seeking out people like me and convincing me, young and with no government experience, hey, it's going to be fine. It's going to be easy. I don't think anybody has any grandiose sense of transformation of the Middle East right now, right? We're not talking about putting boots on the ground. We're not talking about trying to change this country into a democracy. We're not trying to nation build. I don't think we did any of those things. Donald Trump just took out a threat. It was a threat to the United States. It was a threat to the entire region. It was a threat to Israel for sure. And if Iran had gotten the bomb, we talked a lot about what people call it the nuclear cascade, that it would set off a bunch of countries in a row. The Saudis would want it, the Turks would want it, the Egyptians would want it. Now imagine what that Middle East looks like with 5 or 6 nuclear powered countries. That sounds scary. I think we've thwarted that. I think the big question we have to ask ourselves really right now is whether this thing triggers asymmetric attacks. And there, I think, if that is the case, and I hope that it's not, and I don't know how to predict it because, again, I haven't seen the intel. I think the important thing is to not overreact because that's what we did last time, right? We overreacted to a terrorist attack and it led to the conquest of countries across the Middle East and the expenditure of trillions of dollars, and everything was smoldering in its wake. We need to be judicious here. There are ways of ending this regime, even if they decide to engage in these asymmetric attacks. The point is, don't overreact. Handle this professionally, handle it quickly, deftly, and hopefully move on.
You're talking there, Jonathan, about 9/11.
Yeah.
You're saying that's an overreaction. Are you suggesting that the Iranian regime could have the capacity to direct or inspire something of that scale again?
You know what? I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, have they put IRGC officials in the past or IRGC operatives in the past in the US? I think that's probably a yes. Are they capable of penetrating the dragnet of Homeland Security? Have they eluded the FBI and Homeland Security here? Have they eluded, MI5 back in the UK? I don't know how to answer that right now, but I've got to imagine that since this war broke out on October 7th, not from 9 days ago, but I've got to imagine since October 7th, every country in the West has been watching and they've been tracking. And my hope is that over the last, let's say, 9 days, since Israel began this, and I think the US understood where this was going,
Mm.
this was coordinated. I mean, just to be clear, the Israelis struck on day 61 after Trump gave Iran a 60-day deadline, right? And then Donald Trump came in after he hinted at it for just a little bit. And then he said during his speech that the partnership was unlike anything anybody had seen in history. I'm paraphrasing, but it was the same sort of bravado that we hear from Donald Trump, but he was really touting this coordination with the Israelis. So I think they knew what was coming. I'm sure the UK, the Five Eyes relationships that we have, I'm sure they were also aware of what was likely going to come, and I think they probably prepared. So the question is, have they prepared well enough? Have they thwarted whatever the Iranian regime may want to try? But again, I come back to this one thing. Do they understand that they have lost? Do they understand that it's not worth the fight any longer? And then, if they have, and this is where it gets really interesting, do we allow this regime to exist?
Mm.
And there, I think, is getting back to your question, right? If we say we're demanding regime change, that may trigger folks here in Washington and around the world because people are going to say that's what leads to the chaos. That's what leads to the instability. But then again, just to play devil's advocate here, this regime has been nothing but chaos and instability. So people are going to say, better the devil that you know. I'm not sure I buy that argument, but I also don't know if I want to be the guy that is responsible for opening Pandora's box. So
Mm.
this is the kind of debate that's going on right now, certainly among what we would call neo-isolationist circles at the Pentagon, where they're like, look, we bombed this thing, that's great, but we're not going a step further here, and maybe Donald Trump won't. I do think the Israelis may want to keep on pushing until the regime implodes.
If
And
Iran retaliates against Israel, as we discussed earlier, does that now oblige the United States to continue contributing to defend Israel now that it's done this?
I don't think the US is obliged to do anything here. The US was attacking the Houthis, and then Donald Trump said, I don't want to fight the Houthis anymore. Going to the region, I don't want to fight them. I'm over there and I don't want a war. And so he left the Israelis to their own devices, and the Houthis started attacking Israel again, and Israel had to shoot down missiles. I think Donald Trump could say, look, Israel, you own the airspace. Have fun. And we'll give you some THAAD missiles, these terminal high altitude anti-missile defense systems, which, by the way, don't work as well as the Israeli Arrow, at least as we've seen so far. It's a poor percentage, but we'll add some protection. And the Israelis need to just finish the job. And maybe they do it with American intel, but the US doesn't have a finger on the trigger, so to speak. I think that it all remains to be seen, but this does seem to be coordinated. Trump and Netanyahu seem
Yes.
to have a pretty good understanding of one another. And I think if it's a conventional threat, and it's a conventional threat only, it could be that the Israelis just go back and finish the job. But I will say Donald Trump did warn Iran that if it kept fighting, that there would be consequences.
He also said there would be 2 weeks before he made his decision, and it's turned out to be, I think, fewer than 2 days.
Right. And I think that probably came from the debates within his own party.
Mm.
I do get the sense that some of the key figures that were against this came around.
Yes.
Maybe they saw the way that Donald Trump thrashed Tucker Carlson, who had challenged what MAGA was, and Donald Trump said, I decide What is MAGA? You do not. And he was spanked and put in a corner. And that
And
may have
that's the
been the
same
moment.
as Tulsi Gabbard, right? The
Yes, that's
DNI.
right. And
He
there
was
have been
forced
a
to fall into
handful.
line.
That's right. There have been a handful of these people that were either aligned with Iran or they were aligned with the Qataris. Of course, I'm a line actor in the region as well. I think Donald Trump seems to have set the party straight. And this is just to broaden the lens here for a minute. We need to understand that there is no Trump doctrine.
Yes.
There's nothing written that says we're going to do the following things over the next 4 years. Donald Trump makes these decisions. He has given himself maximum flexibility, and his party has, and his voters have too. They're not demanding that there is a written Trump doctrine or a written foreign policy for a roadmap for the Middle East. So Donald Trump gets to decide if he wants to start fighting the Houthis and then wants to end it. If he wants to engage with Israel and to partner with them on Iran for a night, he can do it. And then he can go back to being quasi isolationist and say, I'm not going to use another munition unless it's China, unless they provoke a war in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Straits. This is the enigma of Donald Trump. I don't know where he goes next. If Iran keeps firing, does he say, I'm coming back, I'm going to send more weapons? I mean, there are still, we understand there were submarines that attacked some of these targets, and maybe those subs are still there, and we see more Tomahawks being fired. But look, in the meantime, Israeli F-35s still have complete air superiority. They don't need to worry about the nuclear program very likely any longer. That means that they get to focus entirely on military infrastructure. And that is bad news for the Islamic Republic.
So, what does this say about Trump in terms of if you are Iran's not allies, but associates, we should say, in this increasing axis around the world, China and Russia? What are you now perhaps calculating differently about Donald Trump?
Well, look, number one is the unpredictability of this man continues to confound all of America's adversaries, right? And we sort of talk about it's China, it's Russia, it's Iran, it's North Korea, right? It's the crink, as we're calling it. The crink's been pretty quiet, at least over the last 4 hours. I've not seen a response. I think they would love to draw him into a protracted conflict. I think everyone knows this. And I think Donald Trump's already said that that's not what he's looking for. And I do think that if this was a four-legged stool, it now sort of looks like three. It's much
Yeah.
less stable. The Iranians, they were providing drones and missiles to the Russians. Maybe they can't any longer. They were providing oil that was sort of off the books, and they were providing to the Russians and the Chinese. Maybe that's now no longer. So you have to start to maybe look at this map a little differently. I don't want to suggest here that Donald Trump has kind of won this new Cold War that's been evolving, or if we're going to call it that.
Yeah.
It's way premature to start taking victory laps on any of this. But I do think that you have to look at these countries like an axis. And I think he's just punctured one of them and they're bleeding out. And
Yeah.
that
I do think
is,
it says something new about Trump because the narrative actually until this point was starting to look like taco. Trump always chickens out. Was Trump really going to do something? Was he going to use American might? Was he blustering? I think now we have some answers to these
yes, I think
questions.
that's true. And again, it's that unpredictability, this sort of brutal nature of him when he decides to, right? I mean, it was actually really interesting. I was listening to that speech and he was talking about Qasem Soleimani, right? This general that he killed back in 2020. This was the key man responsible for terrorism all around the world. He had been attacking American bases. Donald Trump warned him. Nobody thought that Trump would do it. He went ahead and he whacked the guy and it whacked a whole bunch of other people around him too, who were Shia militia leaders from Iraq. And the regime just shut up after that. And everybody began to realize that this guy was deadly serious if you messed with him. And I do think that this is having a much greater effect than the Qasem Soleimani hit. But fascinating was that Donald Trump needed a little bit of help in pronouncing Qasem Soleimani's name.
So many were killed by their general, Qasem Soleimani.
He had a hard time getting it out. And I was just thinking, this was the signature thing that you did back in 2020, and the guy could barely pronounce his name. And this is, I mean, this is the essence of Donald Trump.
Yeah. So there's been an increasing divergence between the United States and Israel and the rest of us. Here I'm talking about countries like Australia, the UK, European, Western countries.
Yeah.
Are they now, I mean, obviously this started over the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. Every time we've seen Israel extend its front, these countries have called for de-escalation. They've been ignored by Bibi Netanyahu. He's gone ahead and he's forged military successes in the region. What does this say about where the allies sit together on Israel or not?
I have to say, I think that what this has done, these 9 days, is that it has shown the world that they were myopic in their view of this war in the Middle East. That this was a seven front war, and it always was, right? It was started with Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we saw the West Bank begin to erupt, rockets out of Syria, rockets out of Iraq. We saw ballistic missiles out of Yemen, harassing of ships on the Red Sea, and of course, Iran itself. And so, for the world to be focused only on what Israel was doing in Gaza was never the right perspective. It was the wrong lens. And now that the Israelis have essentially run the table on all of these fronts. I mean, the only one that's a big question for me, and this is a discussion for maybe another time, is why did Iraq go so quiet? They still have missiles and they still have militiamen there. They could attack if they wanted to, they just haven't. The Houthis have gone pretty quiet since Iran started getting this beating 9 days ago. But this actually could finally end the crisis in Gaza if Hamas sees that it doesn't have a patron any longer and that it's now isolated. They're still holding 53 hostages, roughly, I think, I don't know, 20 of them or fewer are still alive. But if they are released, the war can end tomorrow. The United States would, I think, lean on Israel to end this conflict. But what this, I think, shows here is how interconnected all of these fronts were. And I think the West in general, I'm not even sure the US was inclined to see the interconnectivity of all of it. But I think Benjamin Netanyahu, to his full credit, and I don't love him on every front in Israel. I think the anti-democratic tendencies of a man who's been in power for that long, they bother me.
Yeah.
But I will say that his strategic understanding of the region, I think, cannot be questioned any longer. He has taken out now the head of the octopus after chopping off all of the tentacles. And I think you now may see a certain quiet, maybe, that we haven't seen in a while. Now, again, there are things, they're black swans we can't predict. There could be asymmetric attacks, there could be more missile attacks. But I have to say, those things, at least to me, without having seen them, if they go down that route, it sort of feels like death throes. It doesn't feel like a strategic approach to victory. I just don't see, at least right now, from my vantage point, and I believe me, I can be wrong. I've been wrong about so many things during this conflict. I can't predict anything. We sort of have this joke where I'm constantly saying that was not on my bingo card, and people just keep telling me I need to get a new bingo card or find another game to play. But I've not been able to predict much. But I will just say that if Iran does decide to attack, it's not coming from a place of strength. It will be from a place of total weakness and potentially a decision to be a martyr, which is, of course, part of that Shiite culture.
And final question, Jonathan Schanzer. This was all triggered by the October 7 attacks. If you're Iran, if you're Hamas, was that now a catastrophic mistake?
It was. It obviously was. But I think when I look at the mistakes that were made, the biggest mistake was that they didn't commit to doing what they had intended to do.
Mm-hmm.
And some people say that Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of the 10/7 attacks, jumped the gun, or he decided that he was just going to do it early because it was in his interest, or there was cold feet. But the ring of fire that they had envisioned, where Hamas goes in and then Hezbollah goes in from the north, and then the rockets come from Iraq and Syria, the missiles come from the Houthis, the Iranian regime fires, there are thousands and thousands. If they had saturated Israeli airspace along with the invasion, I don't know what kind of map we would be looking at right now.
Mm.
And so, yes, it was a catastrophic mistake, but I think they could have fought this war very differently. And I think when you see hesitation, and this is the real difference, the Israelis have not hesitated. Maybe you could say that they waited on Hezbollah, but I think they were being restrained by the Biden administration primarily. And when it came to the regime in Iran, even after the strikes that they launched that removed the missile defense that the regime had back in October, they were still being restrained. The moments that they have been exceptional have been the moments that they've moved quickly and swiftly and unequivocally. And that's what they've done. When I compare these two kinds of responses, this has always been, by the way, the Israelis have won war after war in the region because they have fought according to their own doctrine, which is at the end of the day, taking the war to the enemy's territory and then making quick work of them. So we saw it with the pagers. We saw it with what's just happened over these last 9 days. The Gaza war is maybe the only exception, and that is, I think, because it has been such a complex urban warfare environment, and there are so many people that are packed in there. And Israel's enemies knew it, that they could drag out that war. My hope,
Yeah.
anyway, is that these other swift victories have now paved the way for something that will finally end that misery in Gaza, and maybe we can go back to whatever life looked like before October 7th. I can barely remember it now. It's been a grueling year and a half, but one does get a sense that tonight, it's still night where I am. It's a massive milestone, just an unbelievable turn of events that I think could, if we're fortunate, could put the Middle East on a different trajectory. Not a guarantee, but there's now at least an opportunity for a different arc from where we've been.
And on that note, thank you so much for staying up late and for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.